Hello and welcome to Varn. And today we're going to be continuing our discussion of Breaking Chains of Reason by Alasdair MacIntyre, originally published in Out of Apathy in 1960, republished in MacIntyre's Engagements with Marxism, edited by Paul Blackledge and Neil Davidson, published in 2005. We're on section 6. MacIntyre has already gone through what he sees as the stultification of most of the university disciplines in light of their removal of many of the more interesting and liberatory forces of the ideas that they are using. He's talked about this in terms of Wittgensteinian philosophy being turned into linguistic formalism in light of Freudianism being used to get people therapeutically more accepting to the status quo, etc. Now we turn to section 6. This is MacIntyre. This, then, is the ideology of apathy and conformism. It provides the ideal climate in which to disarm the intellectual and transform him into an educational technician who can safely be charged with training the social administrators of the established order. How are we to break it hold upon us? Many of the fallacies in it have been exhibited in the course of the argument, and the Hegelian and Marxist alternatives have appeared to point the context from time to time. But how are we to live out that alternative in both our thinking and our action? Not by the manipulation of people so that they will move in some direction that we desire, but by helping them move to where they desire. The goal is not happiness or satisfaction, but freedom. And freedom has both means and an end. The mechanistic separation of means and ends is suitable enough for human manipulation, but not for human liberation. This is kind of a critique of a lot of the more structuralist views of how we should handle human arrangements, and particularly also technocratic views. And let's go back to Weber. This entails a decisive break with utilitarianism. This is a theme in MacIntyre's work. It is one of the main points of After Virtue. So this is consistent from his Marxist period to his communitarian Catholic period. Marxists have in the past crippled themselves intellectually by adopting even their Marxism to determinist mechanistic mold. I think here of the career of George Lukács, somebody I've commented on a lot lately, for good and ill. Lukács faced the dilemmas of bourgeois sociology as they were classically presented in the works of Max Weber and found a solution in the work of Hegel and Marx. He participated in the Hungarian Soviets of 1919 and was the Minister of Education in Bela Kun's government. Then when he expounded Marxism in 1923, he came up against the mechanistic attitude of the right-wing Soviet Marxist. He recounted and allowed that he had underestimated the objective rate of historical determination and underestimated human possibility. Weighed down by the specious argument of determinism, he lived through an era of objective necessity. We must do the lesser evil for the greater good. We must use the means for that end. We must pull the levels of the trials of Bukharin and Radek and the rest to move on to the machine of Soviet society. This, by the way, is the more sophisticated form of what we see in people like the Midwestern Marxist crew, except much more vulgar in their instances. Then in 1956, he broke when Nagy broke through the smokescreen. If the Stalinist ways of thinking, Lukács again became Minister of Education. He vindicated his philosophical work in his life. In the social democratic tradition, too, utilitarianism has dominated, and with its mechanistic modes of thought. And social democracy has become quite self-conscious in its Benthamite approach. What Benthamite utilitarianism lacked, as J.S. Mill once saw, and what liberalism, by becoming utilitarian, came to lack, was any critique of satisfaction. The ultimate criterion of happiness, and happiness is simply a state in which people are getting what they avowedly want. There is no scope within the terms of utilitarianism for criticizing their preferences, so that one seems condemned if one remains within the terms of Benthamism to say that people are satisfied if they got what they think they want. And if one attempts to emerge from those confines and say that one knows what people really want, that is, in the long run, if they only had the relevant experience, better than they do themselves, one seems bad to adopt policies which will necessarily compel and coerce people. The second course is a violation of negative freedom. The first is an abnegation of all the unconscious pressures which mold popular taste, and to those who are able to contrive and control such pressures. And it is the first course that the classical utilitarianism adopts as its own. Thus, the utilitarianism can become the instrument for removing the immediate dissatisfaction rather than the doctrine of genuine reform, and that it easily becomes an instrument for contriving people's good rather than for activating people themselves. J.S. Mill's characteristic doctrine on happiness and liberty point to what is absent in Benthamism rather than succeed in repairing the gaps. What matters is that the utilitarian spirit accords exactly with the changing purposes of capitalism. Dickens has remarked through the character of Gradgrin and Bounderby how capitalism found the application for utilitarian themes. It has less often been remarked how easily utilitarian wears a Fabian dress and appears as a maximizer of common interest in the promotion of pleasure and the diminishment of pain. At 2 points, the utilitarianism informs Fabianism. By setting in front of all men the common goal of the greatest happiness of the greatest number, in itself a harmless and humane slogan, it encourages the belief that there is a common interest in society. So that what is needed is an adjustment of interest, whereas Marxists differ from Fabians in asserting that class-divided society, there is a fundamental conflict of interest, and that there can be no reconciliation of these interests. Again, utilitarian offers to Fabianism the idea that it is the group of the intellect and benevolent administrators whose native wit and training have provided them with the relevant knowledge which the masses lack, who will contrive this adjustment of the interest for society. This is precisely the spirit of welfare capitalism, profoundly as the interests differ under capitalism profoundly as the interest of different classes, I'm adding that's not in the original text, under capitalism are divided, it remains the case that there is a need for this clash to be concealed, for the mask of the common interest to be worn. Thus, the demand for social insurance, health services, and educational opportunity open up a certain limited point, can express militant dissatisfaction with capitalism, and yet be skillfully tamed by the capitalist administrative machine. Bismarck was the pioneer here, and the Fabian tradition is so comfortably close to Bismarck. And one could add the Lassallean tradition and the Keynesian social democratic tradition, etc., all pretty much accepted this. Claremont's work on the capitalist order actually sees like this kind of social compact compromise as one of the ways to deal with the crises of the early 20th century capitalism, as opposed to, say, the fascist mode of dealing with said crisis. The breakthrough comes from awakening what Marx called self-activity. Dissatisfaction with the established order, which is that awakening appears to be spontaneously of any importance in our society. But it is too often allowed to die or is discouraged, or if sufficiently militant specimen of working class activity receives direct hostility. Our deep need is instead to provide all the growing points of human activity against the present social order with coherent theoretical expression, so that they may be rationally guided and effective. What is necessary for the intellectual is to accept his responsibilities for this, both in the working class movement and to those for whom he is profoundly responsible. In other words, the intellectual must be accountable to the class for which he speaks. It's not the intellectual cannot belong It has to necessarily organically come from that class, but it must be subordinated to the interests of that class. The expert must answer to what the class wants, not what the expert thinks is best. So anyone who wishes to politicize politics as professional and wishes to do so as if it requires expertise separate from all other work is saying that the working class cannot rule itself, even if it is also doing so in the name of, quote, expanding democracy. By democracy, they do not mean the people being able to contribute to their own rule. That's me speaking. Anyone who has taught in the university since the war, this is World War II, has seen three phases of student life. There was the ex-service generation, for whom many of the causes and motives of the 30s remained alive. Their maturity and experience have been remarked on often enough. What gave that maturity its edge was a sense of enormous possibilities that the war had opened up, possibilities which were gradually to disappear in the Cold War climate. The next generation was essentially the children of the war and the Cold War. These are the baby boomers, by the way, in America. Their younger days were surrounded by consciousness of shortage and uncertainty. That is not true in America. This is something where the British experience actually is profoundly different than the American. The baby boomers, the children of the people in the war, actually in America knew the greatest prosperity the U.S. had ever known, whereas in Britain it was the other way around. The next generation were essentially the children of the war and the Cold War. Their younger days surrounded by the consciousness of shortage and uncertainty. Their adolescence presented with newly made careerism of welfare capitalism. They were the non-political, the non-anything, the university's gift to Lord Hassen. For they were conservative in a profound sense that they accepted the environment as given. This would be more true for Gen Xers in America. All they had to do was to find a suitably sheltered niche. This is kind of true for late boomers too, but not early ones. This started to change as the 50s wore on and ended in 1956, not with a whimper, but a bang. The twin crimes of the Suez Canal and Hungary, the premeditated crime of nuclear warfare, and moreover, the apparent deadness and dullness of cynicism of official politicians in the face of these things, these launched students along with other adolescents into a world of political questions. Of political questions, not of political answers. All the tremendous and adolescent energy, which with their rawness of the emotion makes so impressive, is still looking for the intellectual satisfaction at the political level. Abstract. What is interesting about this is, while the conditions of the baby boomers are fundamentally different, their expression in a kind of in the university actually rhymes in Britain, the UK, and in France. I mean, in Britain, not the UK because that's redundant. The US and in France, and manifests about the same time, even if the conditions that were prompting it are actually kind of different. And that's something to think about when we think about the New Left in the 60s. All the tremendous adolescent energy with the vast rawness of emotion makes so impressive is still looking for intellectual satisfaction at the political level. If no coherent answers are found, and remember, this is written in 1960. This is not written in 1968. So this is actually kind of predictive. If no coherent answers are found, then the student generations pass on. They will become more frustrated and disillusioned for having been so hopeful in the past, as asterisk, which they do. This is the beginning of what Christopher Lasch calls the culture of narcissism in the 70s. And he's pointing out that and MacIntyre is foreseeing this in 1960. Keep that in mind. And this is what reactionaries hope for. I was socialist when I was young too. The unspoken completion of this. How good to grow middle-aged, conservative, and self-satisfied like me. Which has been a historical trend until very recently. It is not a historical trend anymore. Points to the danger. The stilting up of the poetry of adolescence into the prose of bourgeois middle age. All the pressures are there. There is no need to get they need to get a job, to succeed in it, to bring up a family, and to pay for a house. Not to succumb to these with the feeling and the questioning must find a theory and a way of life which will transmute the poetry of adolescence into continuous, lifelong activity, which we've never really done. That's me talking. Two images have been with me throughout writing this essay. Between them, they seem to show the alternative path for the intellectual. The one is of John Maynard Keynes and the other Leon Trotsky. Both were obviously men of attractive personality and natural gifts. Those the intellectual guardian of the established order, providing you policies and theories of the manipulation to keep society from what he took to be economically trim and make a personal fortune in the process. Keynes was one of the few economists to do that. That's me talking. The other, an outcast from a revolutionary from Russia, both under the Tsar and under Stalin, providing through his life a defense of human activity and the powers of conscious and rational human effort. I think of them at the end, Keynes with his peerage, Trotsky with an ice pick in a skull. These are the twin lines between which the intellectual choice in our society lives. Philosophers have continued to interpret the world differently. The point, however, remains to change it. That question of Keynes or Trotsky, Trotsky being dead with a knife pick in his skull, the causal possibility there. Keynes dying with peerage, becoming a darling of both the social democratic and welfarist left, and becoming later on the dream of most of the current left today. Even those who are radicals still proclaim his reformism as a primary goal. Where are you? Have you also given up on any vision beyond this? Most people have, even when they claim they haven't. You see this today and the turning away. All the foreclosure of revolutionary activity in America, whether there's, quote, no proletariat because everyone is settlers, etc., to, well, we have to meet people where they are and tail them with populism, etc. All these times are the same thing as opportunism. And if you call it opportunism, people will accuse you of having a purity fetish. And yet they will fail. I will point out to them that they have failed to achieve what they said they would in any case, whether purity fetish is real or not. It's a question, and a question you must ask yourself about the relationship between academia and Marxism, the stulting of academia, and its relationship to the stultifying of Marxism under non-Marxist terms. And perhaps Marxism has its own problem here, and perhaps that needs to be dealt with. But it can't be dealt with unless we also clarify what the other conditions were, what would not be looked at, and what hasn't been. This was obvious to Alasdair MacIntyre in 1960. And it's amazing how it still feels obvious now, even though we've seen the result. I'd like to thank my new Patreon supporter on the Connor Kakana novel on your left for his support. I'd like to thank all my Patreons for making series like these possible. Check this out, read it, deal with it. You're not going to agree with all of it. I don't agree with all of it. I mean, one thing you might say, oh, well, Trotsky or Keynes, we have more options than that. Yes, you do. And perhaps maybe the point is to move beyond this paradigm of the 1930s and reliving the past, both the technocratic past of Fordism and the social welfare state, and of the other forms of Marxist-Leninism, not because they are wrong, but because they are in the main gone. That is all.